Tonight, you will once again return to the quiet world of Detective Edmund Blackwood and to the calm, unhurried mysteries that seem to reveal themselves only to his patient and observant mind. These are not cases of violence or urgency, but of subtle disturbances in the ordinary fabric of life, where something small and easily overlooked begins to repeat itself with quiet precision. There are streets in London that belong more to memory than to time. They remain unchanged while the rest of the city moves forward around them. Their lamps continue to burn with the same soft amber glow, their windows reflect the same gentle dimness, and their silence settles in the same careful way each night. One such street lies just beyond the quieter districts west of the river, where the evening air seems to hold itself in suspension long after midnight has passed. It was there, on a narrow pavement lined with modest townhouses and leaning iron railings, that the pattern first became visible. Blackwood had not been searching for anything unusual. He had been walking, as he often did, in the late hours when the city withdrew into itself and the noise of the day dissolved into distance. The rhythm of his steps was unhurried, guided not by destination but by observation. The street had offered nothing remarkable at first. Its lamps stood at regular intervals. Its windows were dark. Its stillness was complete. And yet, stillness can be deceptive. At precisely 14 minutes past 2 in the morning, a figure appeared at the far end of the street. There was nothing outwardly dramatic about him. He walked at a measured pace, neither slow nor hurried, his posture upright, his hands resting loosely at his sides. His coat was long and dark, its fabric moving only slightly with each step. His face remained indistinct beneath the softened glow of the nearest lamp, and yet his presence carried a clarity that distinguished him from shadow. He did not hesitate. He did not pause. He simply walked. He moved past the same row of houses, beneath the same sequence of lamps, and continued without deviation toward the opposite end of the street, where darkness gathered more completely. Within moments, he was gone. The street returned to stillness. Blackwood remained where he stood, his attention fixed not on the absence that followed, but on the precision of what he had witnessed. There had been no uncertainty in the timing. The appearance had occurred at a definite minute, as though guided by a mechanism rather than intention. It would have been easy to dismiss the moment as coincidence. London is a city of late movements and solitary figures. Yet something within the rhythm of the man's steps suggested repetition rather than spontaneity. The following night, Blackwood returned. The street greeted him with the same quiet indifference. The lamps burned with the same muted glow. The air remained perfectly still. Time moved forward without emphasis. At precisely 14 minutes past 2, the figure appeared again. He emerged from the same point in darkness. His pace remained identical. His posture unchanged. He passed beneath each lamp in exactly the same sequence, neither accelerating nor slowing, and disappeared into the same unlit distance beyond. There was no variation. On the third night, the pattern repeated itself with the same calm precision. The street did not resist him. It did not acknowledge him. It simply received him, as though his presence belonged to its structure as naturally as the lamps themselves. Repetition, when undisturbed, acquires weight. Blackwood observed the figure from a different vantage point on the fourth night, standing closer to the pavement where the man would pass. The sound of footsteps emerged first, quiet and evenly spaced. Then the figure himself entered the softened circle of lamplight. His face remained indistinct, yet his features carried no urgency. There was no tension in his posture, no awareness of being observed. His gaze remained fixed ahead, not searching, not avoiding. His movement was steady, mechanical in its consistency, yet entirely human in its form. He passed within a few feet. There was no acknowledgement. The air remained undisturbed. The figure continued forward and disappeared once more into darkness. Blackwood did not follow. Not yet. There are moments when observation offers more clarity than pursuit, and this was such a moment. The street itself seemed to participate in the pattern, preserving it through its silence. It was only later, through careful examination of municipal records and older documents preserved in quiet archives, that a detail emerged which altered the nature of the observation entirely. The description of the man, his coat, his posture, and his nightly route matched the account of a resident who had lived on that very street many years before. A man who had walked the same route each night. A man whose habits had been noted for their unusual precision. A man who, according to every official record, had died a decade ago. And yet, each night at precisely 14 minutes past 2, the street appeared to remember him. There is a particular kind of understanding that does not arrive with urgency, but instead settles quietly, like dust upon a surface that has long remained undisturbed. When Blackwood confirmed, through official record and careful verification, that Thomas Avery had died 10 years earlier, he did not experience disbelief. He experienced recognition. The pattern he had observed on that quiet London street did not become less real because it contradicted expectation. If anything, it became more deserving of patience. He returned again the following evening, long before the appointed hour, and took care to approach the street without intention of interruption. It is one thing to witness an event once, and another to witness it repeatedly. Repetition carries its own form of evidence, and evidence, when allowed to present itself without force, often reveals more than direct inquiry ever could. The street greeted him in the same manner it always had, with an indifference that was neither welcoming nor resistant. Its lamps stood at their measured intervals. Its houses remained silent behind drawn curtains. The pavement held the faint memory of countless footsteps, each one now indistinguishable from the last. Nothing in its appearance suggested that it belonged to anything but the present moment. Yet Blackwood understood that appearances are rarely complete. He walked slowly along the pavement, allowing his attention to rest upon the physical structure of the place. The stone steps before each townhouse bore the gentle wear of years. Iron railings leaned slightly, shaped by gravity and time rather than neglect. These were not dramatic details, but they were honest ones. They spoke not of mystery, but of continuity. When he reached the townhouse that had once belonged to Avery, he paused without ceremony. The doorway itself was unremarkable. Its paint had faded evenly. Its brass fixtures reflected only the dimmest suggestion of light. But it was the step beneath the door that held his attention. Along its outer edge ran a narrow mark, shallow but consistent, as though something had touched that exact point again and again over a span of years. It was not damage in the ordinary sense. It was a trace of repetition. Blackwood did not immediately assign meaning to it. He simply acknowledged that it existed and allowed the observation to settle alongside the others. Time passed without emphasis. The distant sounds of the city grew softer as the hour advanced, withdrawing into a background that no longer demanded notice. The lamps took full possession of the street, casting their steady amber light across the pavement. The air itself seemed to grow more still, as though movement had become unnecessary. Blackwood returned to the position from which he had observed the figure before. He did not conceal himself. He did not alter his presence. He remained as he was, allowing the pattern, if it existed, to continue undisturbed. At precisely 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps returned. They emerged gradually, quiet and evenly spaced, carrying the same calm precision that had marked their presence on previous nights. There was no hesitation in their rhythm. They did not accelerate or falter. They simply existed, moving forward with the certainty of something long established. The figure appeared soon after, entering the softened circle of lamplight with the same steady motion. There was nothing theatrical in his presence. His coat moved only slightly as he walked. His posture remained upright. His gaze remained fixed ahead, not searching, not avoiding. He walked not as a man exploring his surroundings, but as one fulfilling a familiar and unquestioned routine. Blackwood observed him closely as he passed. The details confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The man's clothing belonged to an earlier time. Its cut was precise, its condition orderly, but it did not belong to the present decade. More striking still was the consistency of his movement. Each step followed the last with exact spacing, as though measured against something invisible but unchanging. When the figure came within a few feet, Blackwood spoke in a calm and ordinary tone. "Good evening." The words entered the space between them without resistance. The figure did not respond. He did not turn his head. He did not slow. He did not acknowledge that any sound had reached him. His movement continued exactly as before, uninterrupted and complete. Blackwood felt no urgency to repeat himself. Silence, in such moments, is often more revealing than persistence. He continued to watch as the figure moved beneath the next lamp, and then the next, each pool of light receiving him in turn before allowing him to pass on. There was no variation, no uncertainty. The street accepted his presence as naturally as it accepted the night itself. As the figure approached the far end, Blackwood noticed something subtle but unmistakable. The man's shadow did not behave as it should have. It did not lengthen or fade in response to the distance between the figure and the lamp. It remained nearly constant, as though it belonged not to the moment, but to the repetition of the moment. Soon after, the figure disappeared into the deeper darkness beyond the final lamp. The street returned to stillness. Blackwood remained where he was, not in expectation of further movement, but in acknowledgement of what had already occurred. There was no sense of conclusion in the disappearance, only continuation. He allowed his attention to return once more to the townhouse that had once belonged to Avery. Routine, when practiced with enough consistency, becomes something greater than habit. It becomes structure. It shapes not only the individual, but the environment in which the individual exists. It leaves traces that do not easily disappear. Blackwood understood then that whatever he was witnessing was not an interruption of reality, but an extension of something that had once been entirely ordinary. The street had not created the pattern. It had preserved it. And each night, at precisely 14 minutes past 2, it allowed that pattern to continue. There are addresses in London that continue to exist long after their occupants have ceased to belong to them. Their doors remain closed with the same quiet composure. Their windows continue to reflect the same measured light. Nothing in their appearance suggests absence, and yet absence is precisely what they contain. It was with this understanding that Blackwood returned, in the late hours of the following evening, to stand once more before the townhouse that had once belonged to Thomas Avery. He arrived earlier than before, not because he expected the pattern to change, but because he wished to observe the street in its untouched state before the hour imposed its quiet repetition upon it. The lamps had already begun their slow transition into brightness, and the air carried that particular stillness which belongs only to places where movement has gradually withdrawn. The house itself did not distinguish itself from its neighbors. Its facade bore the same patient wear as the others. Its windows were dark, their surfaces holding only the faintest reflection of the street. Yet there was something in its stillness that suggested completion rather than emptiness, as though whatever had once occupied it had done so with enough consistency to leave a form behind. Blackwood stood for some time without moving, allowing his attention to settle upon details that might otherwise remain unnoticed. The doorframe bore slight irregularities in its paint, the result of years of careful use. The iron railing beside the steps had been touched often enough to lose the sharper edges of its original shape. These were not signs of neglect. They were signs of continuity. He lowered his gaze once more to the stone step. The narrow mark he had observed the previous night remained exactly as it had been, faint but deliberate. It followed no natural crack in the stone. It had not been made by accident. Its presence suggested repetition carried out without variation. Blackwood understood, without needing confirmation, that this mark had not appeared suddenly. It had been formed gradually, over a span of time long enough for the act that created it to become invisible to memory. He considered, then, the nature of routine. A man who leaves his home at the same hour each night does not think of the act as significant. He does not observe his own repetition. He simply performs it, allowing the rhythm to carry him forward. Yet the world observes. Stone observes. Wood observes. The smallest physical contact, repeated without interruption, becomes a form of inscription. Blackwood stepped back and allowed his attention to rise again to the windows. There was no movement within, no suggestion of occupation, and yet the house did not feel abandoned. It felt settled, as though it had accepted the absence of its former occupant without resistance. Time moved forward quietly. The distant sounds of the city grew faint, dissolving into the background until the street existed in near isolation. The lamps now held full authority over the pavement, their steady glow creating the same sequence of illuminated intervals that had framed the figure's passage on previous nights. Blackwood did not return immediately to his usual position. Instead, he remained near the doorway of Avery's former residence, observing the street from the perspective the man himself might once have known. He imagined, not with speculation but with measured consideration, the act of leaving that door at precisely the same hour each night. The hand upon the handle, the brief pause upon the step, the first movement into the street. These were not dramatic actions. They were ordinary, and yet their repetition had given them permanence. When Blackwood finally checked his watch, the hour had already begun its quiet approach toward its appointed minute. He moved then, slowly and without urgency, to the place where the figure would soon appear. The street remained undisturbed. At 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps returned. They emerged with the same calm precision as always, neither louder nor softer, neither hurried nor delayed. The figure followed, entering the lamplight with the same steady motion, his presence neither concealed nor announced. Blackwood observed him closely, but without expectation of change. The man's posture remained upright. His pace remained exact. His gaze remained fixed ahead, as though guided by memory rather than awareness. There was no tension in his movement, no uncertainty in his direction. As he passed the townhouse that had once belonged to him, nothing occurred. He did not pause. He did not hesitate. He did not acknowledge the doorway in any visible way. And yet, in that moment, Blackwood understood something that had not been clear before. The pattern did not begin at the door. It began after the door. The act of walking was not a departure. It was a continuation. Blackwood followed at a distance, not to interrupt, but to understand the shape of the route itself. The figure moved beneath each lamp in sequence, the rhythm of his steps unchanged. The street received him without resistance. There were no witnesses, no sound beyond the quiet repetition of movement. And yet, as the figure approached the far end of the street, Blackwood noticed something he had not allowed himself to consider until now. The man never arrived from anywhere. He only appeared. The darkness from which he emerged did not reveal origin. It revealed only continuation. There was no visible approach beyond the point of first appearance. No suggestion of distance traveled before entering the street. And when he disappeared, he did not arrive anywhere. He simply ceased to be visible. Blackwood came to a stop beneath the final lamp and allowed the darkness ahead to remain untouched. There are limits to observation, and those limits must be respected if observation is to remain meaningful. He turned then and looked back toward the townhouse. The street had returned to stillness once more. The lamps burned as they always had. The windows remained silent. Nothing had changed. And yet, with quiet certainty, Blackwood understood that he was no longer observing a man walking along a street. He was observing a moment that had never fully ended. There is a particular quiet that belongs only to places where time is stored rather than spent. Blackwood entered the municipal archive in the late afternoon, at an hour when the city beyond its walls still carried motion, but inside, motion had long ago been replaced by preservation. The building itself did not present importance in any obvious way. Its exterior was modest, its windows tall and narrow, its entrance marked not by grandeur but by function. Yet within it existed the accumulated record of lives that had passed without spectacle, their existence reduced to paper, ink, and careful order. The interior welcomed him with the familiar stillness of documented memory. Shelves extended in patient rows, holding files that had not been disturbed in years, and perhaps had never been disturbed at all since the moment they were first placed there. The air carried a faint dryness, not unpleasant, but indicative of permanence. It was the atmosphere of continuity, where nothing was lost, but nothing moved forward either. Blackwood approached the desk and requested the file for Thomas Avery. His voice carried no urgency, and the clerk who received the request showed no curiosity. Names passed through such hands every day, and most of them belonged to people whose stories no longer held consequence. Avery's name did not distinguish itself. It existed as one among many. When the file was finally placed before him, Blackwood did not open it immediately. He allowed his hand to rest upon its surface for a moment, as though acknowledging not the paper itself, but the life it represented. Then, with the same patience that had guided his observation on the street, he opened it and began to read. The first pages contained the ordinary confirmations of existence. An address on the very street Blackwood had come to know so well. A profession listed simply as municipal clerk. Dates of employment that extended across years without interruption. The language of the file was precise, but without personality. It recorded presence without interpretation and continuity without reflection. Thomas Avery had lived alone for the entirety of his recorded tenancy. There were no additional occupants listed at his residence, no transfers, no interruptions in occupancy. His employment history revealed the same quiet consistency. He had not advanced rapidly, nor had he fallen behind. He had remained exactly where he was, performing the same duties, arriving and departing at the same hours, until the final entry confirmed that he had ceased to appear. Blackwood continued reading, allowing the rhythm of the records to establish their own form of narrative. It was not a story shaped by dramatic events, but by repetition. The absence of irregularity became, in itself, a form of definition. It was within an older document, placed among the others without emphasis, that he encountered the first detail that connected the written record directly to what he had observed. The document was a complaint, submitted by a neighbor whose name no longer held significance beyond the paper itself. The language was measured, but carried the quiet fatigue of someone who had endured a pattern too consistent to ignore. The neighbor described the sound of footsteps passing outside at the same hour each night. There was no accusation, only the acknowledgement of repetition. The hour itself had been recorded with unusual precision. 2:14 in the morning. Blackwood allowed his eyes to remain upon the number, not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed what the street had already shown him. The record had not been created to explain the pattern. It had been created simply because someone had noticed it. He turned the page and continued. The final entries concerned Avery's death, and even here the tone of the record did not change. It described no struggle, no disruption, no event beyond the quiet cessation of routine. Avery had been found within his residence after failing to appear for work. His passing had been attributed to natural causes. There was no indication that his habits had altered beforehand. No suggestion that he had anticipated an ending. The file did not attempt to explain the man. It only confirmed that he had existed, and that he had ceased to exist in the way records could measure. Blackwood closed the file with the same care he had used to open it. The room around him remained unchanged. Other files rested in their places, containing other lives defined by their own forms of repetition and conclusion. Nothing in the archive reacted to his discovery, because discovery within such places was not an event. It was a process. He left the building as evening settled gradually across the city, and by the time he returned to the street, the lamps had already begun their quiet work of illumination. Their light rested upon the pavement in the same steady intervals he had come to recognize, and the houses received that light without response. Blackwood took his position along the pavement, not with anticipation, but with understanding. The records had not explained the pattern. They had confirmed its origin. They had revealed that the man he observed each night had once walked there not as a mystery, but as a habit. When the hour reached 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps returned once more. They carried the same calm precision, neither louder nor softer than before, and the figure followed them into the light with the same steady presence. His posture remained unchanged. His pace remained exact. His movement contained no uncertainty, no awareness of interruption. Blackwood watched him pass the townhouse that had once been his residence, and in that moment, he understood something that the records themselves could never have contained. The file had recorded the end of Thomas Avery's life. But the street, in its quiet and patient way, had never recorded the end of his routine. There is a particular intimacy in observing a place not from the outside, but from within. Until now, Blackwood had watched the street as an external witness, allowing its lamps, its pavement, and its quiet repetition to present themselves without interference. Yet every routine, no matter how precise, exists in relation to more than one point of view. A man who walks the same path each night does not experience it only as a figure upon the pavement. He experiences it first as someone who departs from a doorway, who pauses at a threshold, who leaves behind the interior stillness of a room. It was this understanding that led Blackwood on the following evening to consider the street from the opposite direction. The townhouse that had once belonged to Thomas Avery was no longer occupied by him, yet the structure itself remained unchanged, and the room behind its front-facing window still existed in the same physical relation to the pavement. Blackwood did not enter the house. Such intrusion was neither necessary nor appropriate. Instead, he positioned himself across the street, where the window could be observed directly, and where the relationship between the interior and the exterior could be understood as a continuous space rather than a boundary. The window itself revealed nothing at first. Its curtains were drawn with careful symmetry, allowing no view of the room beyond. The glass reflected only the muted glow of the street lamp and the faint suggestion of the opposite houses. It behaved as all windows do when they have nothing to reveal. And yet, Blackwood remained there, not because he expected movement, but because stillness itself can contain information when observed without impatience. He imagined the room as it might once have been. A chair placed near the wall. A coat resting where it could be reached easily. Perhaps a watch upon a table, consulted each night with quiet certainty. These were not dramatic objects. They were the tools of repetition, the instruments through which routine sustains itself. Time advanced without announcement. The street remained undisturbed. No footsteps passed. No doors opened. The lamps continued their silent work of illumination, casting their steady light upon the pavement. Blackwood allowed himself to remain part of that stillness, neither expecting nor resisting the moment that would soon arrive. When the hour approached 14 minutes past 2, the street entered once again into that familiar condition of suspended quiet. The air seemed to hold itself in balance. Sound withdrew into distance. The lamps appeared brighter, not because their light had changed, but because everything else had receded. The footsteps began. They emerged from the far end of the street with the same measured rhythm, their spacing exact, their presence neither concealed nor emphasized. Blackwood did not turn toward them immediately. Instead, he allowed his attention to remain upon the window. The figure entered the lamplight and moved steadily forward, following the same path he had followed every night before. His posture remained upright. His pace remained unchanged. His presence carried the same calm certainty. He passed the townhouse. And in that moment, something subtle occurred. The window reflected him. This alone was not unusual. All glass reflects what passes before it. Yet the reflection did not behave as Blackwood expected. It did not appear suddenly as the figure entered its angle, nor did it disappear immediately as he moved beyond it. It remained for a fraction longer than it should have, as though the surface of the glass had preserved the image briefly before releasing it. Blackwood did not move. He allowed the observation to exist without interpretation. The figure continued forward, passing beneath the next lamp, and then the next, until he disappeared once more into the darkness beyond the street's end. The pavement returned to stillness. The lamps resumed their quiet watch. The window, too, returned to its ordinary reflection. And yet Blackwood understood that what he had seen did not belong entirely to illusion. Glass does not create images. It only returns what is given to it. If the reflection had lingered, even briefly, it suggested that the movement itself possessed a consistency so complete that it impressed itself upon the environment. He remained there for some time after the disappearance, observing the window in its unchanged state. It revealed nothing further. It did not acknowledge the passage that had just occurred. Yet the relationship between the interior and the exterior had become clearer. Thomas Avery had once stood behind that window. He had once stepped through that doorway. He had once entered the street at precisely the same hour, night after night, until the act itself had ceased to belong entirely to him. Blackwood turned his gaze back toward the pavement, where the lamps continued to cast their steady intervals of light. Routine, when repeated long enough, ceases to require intention. It continues, not because it is chosen, but because it has always been chosen. And somewhere within the quiet structure of that street, the hour still remembered how to receive him. There is a kind of understanding that emerges only when one stops looking at a movement as a whole and begins instead to notice the quiet intervals that give it shape. Until now, Blackwood had observed the man himself. His posture, his pace, his steady and uninterrupted passage through the street. Yet repetition is not defined only by what moves. It is defined equally by what remains still. The spaces between the lamps, the measured placement of light and shadow, and the silent agreement between distance and step were all part of the same structure. It was this quieter structure that drew Blackwood back to the street once again, earlier than usual, while the last traces of evening still lingered in the air. He began at the far end, where the figure always appeared. In daylight, there was nothing unusual about that place. The pavement curved gently, continuing its path without interruption. The houses remained consistent in their form. Nothing suggested arrival or emergence. The darkness that would later conceal the beginning of the man's route did not yet exist. It would form only when the lamps imposed their order upon the night, allowing certain spaces to remain unseen. Blackwood walked slowly along the pavement, not as a man searching for evidence, but as one aligning himself with the physical rhythm of the place. Each lamp stood at a deliberate interval from the next, their placement neither arbitrary nor decorative. They had been arranged to divide the street into measured portions of visibility, creating a sequence through which a figure would pass gradually, emerging into clarity and then receding once more into softness. He paused beneath the first lamp and allowed himself to remain there for a moment. The light rested upon the pavement without movement. It did not flicker. It did not vary. It simply existed, defining its portion of the street with quiet authority. Blackwood then walked forward at an even pace, allowing his own steps to follow a calm and natural rhythm. When he reached the next lamp, he stopped again and turned his gaze back toward the one he had just left behind. The distance between them felt exact, not in the sense of measurement, but in the sense of intention. It was a distance designed to be crossed without hesitation. He continued in this manner along the length of the street, moving from one circle of light to the next. Each interval of shadow softened his presence briefly before the next lamp restored it. In this way, the street created a quiet sequence of appearance and disappearance, not complete enough to conceal, but gentle enough to transform certainty into suggestion. When he reached the far end, where the final lamp surrendered to darkness, he paused once more. The space beyond did not reveal itself. It did not offer explanation. It remained simply what it was, a place where visibility ended, and where the pattern he had observed each night dissolved into absence. Blackwood understood then that the man's route was not defined by where it began or where it ended, but by the portion that could be seen. The visible path was complete in itself. It required no extension beyond its own boundaries. Later, when the hour approached and the lamps resumed their quiet authority over the street, Blackwood took his position beneath one of the central lights. He did not stand there with anticipation, but with recognition. The structure of the place had already revealed itself. Now it would simply fulfill what it had fulfilled before. The stillness deepened as the appointed minute approached. At precisely 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps returned. They emerged gradually, carrying the same measured rhythm that had defined them on every previous night. There was no variation in their spacing, no hesitation in their approach. They moved with the calm certainty of something that had never required adjustment. The figure entered the first circle of light, and his form became clear. He passed through it and entered the shadow between the lamps, where his outline softened but did not disappear. He entered the next circle of light, and his presence returned to clarity once more. The pattern continued without interruption. Blackwood watched not the man alone, but the relationship between the man and the distance he crossed. Each step carried him forward with exact consistency. He did not lengthen his stride. He did not shorten it. The structure of his movement existed in quiet agreement with the structure of the street. As he passed nearby, there was no acknowledgement, no alteration in pace, no indication of awareness. He moved as he always had, fulfilling the route not as a decision, but as a continuation. He crossed the remaining intervals of light and shadow, and for a final moment he stood within the clarity of the last lamp. Then he moved beyond it. His outline softened. His presence diminished. And once again he was gone. The street returned to its natural stillness, the lamps continuing their quiet illumination as though nothing had occurred at all. Blackwood remained where he was for some time, aware now that the repetition he observed did not belong only to the man. It belonged equally to the distance itself. The street had not altered its form to receive him. He had not altered his movement to cross it. Each existed within the other, forming a pattern that required neither awareness nor intention to continue. When Blackwood finally turned and walked the length of the street once more, his own steps carried none of the same precision. He moved as any man would move, guided by choice rather than certainty. Yet the lamps remained as they had always been, and the distance between them remained unchanged. Routine had once shaped the man. And now, in the quiet persistence of the street, that shape remained. There are moments when a mystery does not deepen through discovery, but through the quiet realization that someone else had already seen it, long before it was given a name. Blackwood understood that repetition, when sustained over years, rarely escapes every eye. Even the most ordinary routines leave impressions upon those who live nearby, not because they seek attention, but because consistency itself becomes a form of presence. It was this quiet certainty that led him, on the following evening, to consider not only the street, but those who had lived beside it. The houses along the pavement had stood for decades, their windows facing one another with the familiar intimacy of shared space. Behind those windows had lived people whose lives had intersected with Thomas Avery's routine, whether they had intended to notice it or not. One such resident, according to the archival complaint Blackwood had read, had once taken the time to record the sound of footsteps at precisely 14 minutes past 2. The document itself had been brief, written without drama, and long since forgotten. Yet it remained evidence of attention. Blackwood arrived before midnight and walked the length of the street slowly, allowing the lamps to illuminate the quiet geometry of the houses. Most of the windows remained dark. A few held faint light behind drawn curtains, suggesting the presence of those who preferred wakefulness to sleep. These were not unusual details. They belonged to the natural rhythm of any city. Yet within that rhythm existed the possibility that someone, somewhere behind the glass, had once observed the same figure Blackwood now watched each night. He paused near the townhouse opposite Avery's former residence. Its windows were narrow, their curtains lighter than the others, allowing a softened suggestion of interior space to exist behind them. There was nothing remarkable in their appearance, yet their position offered a clear and uninterrupted view of the pavement. If anyone had noticed the repetition, it would have been from such a place. Blackwood remained there for some time, not with the intention of inquiry, but with the intention of presence. Questions, when asked too directly, often produce incomplete answers. Observation, by contrast, allows truth to emerge without resistance. Time advanced in its usual quiet manner. The lamps burned steadily. The street held its familiar stillness. When the hour approached its appointed minute, Blackwood allowed his attention to rest not upon the bend where the figure would appear, but upon the windows themselves. He understood now that repetition does not exist in isolation. It exists in relation to those who witness it, even when they choose not to act upon what they see. At precisely 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps returned. They carried the same calm precision, their rhythm neither hurried nor delayed. The figure emerged from the darkness and entered the first circle of light, his posture unchanged, his movement steady and without deviation. Blackwood did not move. Instead, he watched the windows. Most remained unchanged, their curtains still, their surfaces reflecting only the steady glow of the lamps. Yet in one of the upper windows, opposite Avery's former residence, there appeared the faintest suggestion of movement. It was not dramatic. It did not declare itself openly. It was only a subtle shift in shadow, as though someone within had adjusted their position slightly, drawn not by alarm, but by recognition. The figure continued his passage beneath the lamps, crossing each interval of light and shadow with the same measured pace. The shadow within the window remained only for a moment longer, then grew still once more. Blackwood did not assign meaning to it immediately. He allowed the observation to exist without conclusion. The presence of another witness did not alter the pattern. It only confirmed that the pattern belonged not solely to his own attention. The figure passed the townhouse that had once been his and continued toward the far end of the street, where the lamps surrendered to darkness. As always, he did not pause. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge the place from which his routine had once begun. He simply continued until he was no longer visible. The street returned to stillness. The window across the pavement remained unchanged, its curtains drawn, its interior silent. Yet Blackwood understood, with quiet certainty, that the pattern he observed had never existed entirely alone. It had been seen before. It had been heard before. It had belonged, for years, to the unnoticed structure of the street. He remained there for some time, allowing the stillness to settle fully once more. Routine does not require understanding in order to continue. It requires only repetition. And somewhere behind the quiet windows of that street, there remained those who had once listened, night after night, to the same measured footsteps and had come to accept them as part of the hour itself. There are certain forms of knowledge that do not reside in documents, nor in objects, but in the quiet memory of those who have spent enough time in one place to observe its unnoticed rhythms. Blackwood understood that streets, like people, are known differently by those who pass through them and those who remain beside them. It was for this reason that, on the following evening, his attention turned not to the houses, nor to the lamps, but to the possibility that someone who had walked that pavement as part of their duty might have witnessed the same repetition long before it had drawn his own notice. London, in its quiet hours, belongs in part to those who keep watch without expectation of recognition. Their presence does not interrupt the night. It moves within it. Blackwood had seen such a figure before, passing the far end of the street in the early hours with the unhurried pace of routine patrol. The constable had shown no particular interest in him, and Blackwood had returned the same courtesy. Yet routine recognizes routine, even when no words are exchanged. He arrived earlier than usual and walked slowly toward the bend where the street met the larger road beyond. The lamps there were spaced more widely, their light less complete, allowing the darkness to gather in softer layers. It was there, at the edge of that quieter boundary, that he saw the constable once again. The man moved at an even pace, his steps steady, his posture relaxed but attentive in the quiet manner of long familiarity. His uniform bore no sign of urgency. It belonged to someone who understood the difference between disturbance and stillness, and who knew that most nights required nothing more than presence. Blackwood inclined his head slightly as the constable approached, and after a moment, the gesture was returned. Neither spoke immediately. Silence, in such moments, is not absence. It is acknowledgement. The constable slowed, his gaze moving briefly along the length of the street, as though confirming that nothing had altered since his last passage. His attention then returned to Blackwood, not with suspicion, but with the quiet curiosity that arises when a familiar place contains an unfamiliar observer. "You've been here before," the constable said at last, his voice calm and without accusation. Blackwood did not deny it. "Yes," he replied, his tone equally measured. "I find the street has a certain consistency." The constable considered this without haste. His eyes moved briefly toward the lamps, then back again. "It does," he said. There was no elaboration in his words, yet they carried the weight of agreement rather than dismissal. Blackwood allowed a moment to pass before speaking again. "Have you ever noticed anyone walking here at the same hour each night?" The question was asked without emphasis, as though it were merely an extension of observation rather than inquiry. The constable did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze down the length of the street, his attention resting upon the quiet sequence of lamps. His expression did not change, yet something within it suggested recognition. "Years ago," he said eventually, "there was a man who walked here every night." The words were spoken not as speculation, but as recollection. Blackwood remained silent, allowing the memory to continue without interruption. "He lived here," the constable added, gesturing faintly toward the row of houses. "Kept to himself. Never caused trouble. Always at the same hour." 2:14, Blackwood thought, though he did not say it aloud. The constable's gaze remained upon the pavement, as though he were seeing not the present street, but another version of it, preserved somewhere within his own experience. "I used to see him sometimes," he continued. "Never spoke to him. Didn't seem like the sort of man who expected conversation." There was no unease in his tone, only calm remembrance. Blackwood understood then that the pattern he observed had once belonged fully to the ordinary world. It had not been hidden. It had simply been accepted. "And then?" Blackwood asked quietly. The constable's attention returned to him. "And then he stopped," he said. The words carried no drama. They did not require it. Routine ends not with announcement, but with absence. Neither man spoke for a moment. The street remained still, its lamps casting their steady light upon the pavement. The constable inclined his head once more, a gesture of quiet conclusion, and continued on his patrol, his steps gradually fading into the distance beyond the bend. Blackwood remained where he was, aware now that the repetition he witnessed had not always belonged to mystery. It had once belonged to life. It had once been seen by others, accepted without question, and allowed to continue until it no longer did. Yet now, at precisely 14 minutes past 2, it had begun again. When the hour arrived and the familiar footsteps emerged once more from the darkness, Blackwood watched them with a different understanding. The figure entered the lamplight with the same steady presence, his pace unchanged, his posture undisturbed. Nothing in his movements suggested interruption. Nothing in his presence suggested beginning. He crossed the street as he always had, passing beneath each lamp with quiet precision, until at last he disappeared beyond the final circle of light. The street returned to stillness. Yet Blackwood understood now that the street had not created the pattern. It had only continued to receive it. There is a difference between learning something from a document and learning it from a living memory. A record is precise, but it is also distant. It fixes a life into dates and formal statements, and then closes the file as though closure were the same as understanding. A person, by contrast, carries knowledge in softer forms. It is not always complete, and it is rarely arranged in neat order, yet it has a texture that paper cannot preserve. Blackwood understood this well, and it was with that understanding that the street began to feel less like a stage for an impossible event, and more like a place where ordinary habit had once been observed by many eyes, even when no one thought to name it as anything unusual. He had made contact, in the most unobtrusive way, with the kind of watchful presence that moves through London at night without drawing attention to itself. There had been no interrogation, no insistence, no formal request. Only the careful exchange of observation, the kind that fits naturally into a quiet street at a late hour. What settled in Blackwood's mind afterward was not a story shaped by drama, but a quiet confirmation that the man had been real, that the routine had been known, and that the hour had belonged to him long before it belonged to any mystery. This knowledge did not break the pattern, it made the pattern more delicate. If Thomas Avery had once walked the street as a living man, then the repetition Blackwood now observed could not be dismissed as imagination. It had origin. It had form. It had once belonged entirely to the ordinary world. And when something ordinary repeats itself beyond its expected ending, it suggests not impossibility, but continuation in a form that no longer depends upon the person who began it. Blackwood returned again, as he always did, before midnight had fully surrendered to morning, and he allowed himself to walk the street slowly, without purpose beyond attention. The lamps rested in their familiar intervals. The windows held their dim reflections. The pavement, worn by decades of footsteps, offered no resistance to being crossed. Yet now, with this new layer of understanding, the street felt less like a place that concealed answers, and more like a place that preserved them quietly. He paused near the townhouse that had once belonged to Avery and allowed his gaze to settle on the doorway, the step, the iron railing beside it. The shallow mark on the stone remained faint but present, a small inscription made by repetition rather than force. It did not insist upon meaning, yet it made it difficult to believe that the routine had ever truly ended. The stone had accepted the pattern, and in doing so, had made it physical. From there, Blackwood let his eyes lift to the upper windows across the street, where earlier nights had offered the faint suggestion that someone still noticed what happened at 2:14. Nothing moved now. Curtains remained drawn, and the glass returned only the lamps and the quiet line of the pavement. Yet the absence of movement did not lessen the possibility of observation. Familiar sounds often remain present even when no one actively listens for them. As the hours passed, the city's distant noise softened, and the street entered that familiar condition of suspended calm. Blackwood had begun to recognize it as part of the pattern itself. The air grew still. The lamps held their light with quiet certainty. The street existed exactly as it had before, unchanged and prepared. He positioned himself beneath one of the central lamps and allowed himself to remain there without expectation. At precisely 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps emerged again. They arrived with the same calm rhythm, neither hurried nor delayed, and the figure followed them into the light with the same steady posture and measured pace. Nothing in his movements suggested awareness. Nothing suggested hesitation. He walked as though the act itself had never required decision. Blackwood watched him now with a different understanding. He no longer questioned whether the figure belonged to the street. He questioned only what still held the figure in place. As the man passed beneath the lamps, his form emerged and softened in the same gentle sequence. Light received him. Shadow released him. The street neither resisted nor acknowledged his presence. It simply allowed the movement to continue. When the figure passed the townhouse that had once been his, nothing changed outwardly. The door remained closed. The step remained still. And yet the connection between them remained undeniable. The place and the movement belonged to the same structure of memory. The figure continued toward the far end, crossing the final interval of light before fading once more into darkness. The street returned to stillness. Blackwood remained where he was, aware now that he was not witnessing an interruption of reality, but the persistence of something that had once been entirely real. Routine, when practiced long enough, does not vanish easily. It leaves an impression upon the world, and sometimes, in the quietest places, that impression continues long after the life that formed it has ended. And somewhere within that quiet London street, the hours still remembered how to receive him. There are objects in every life that exist not merely to serve a function, but to give shape to time itself. A watch, more than most things, becomes an extension of routine. It divides the day into quiet agreements. It confirms when one should rise, when one should depart, and when one should return. Over years of use, it ceases to be noticed. It becomes part of the rhythm it measures. Blackwood understood that a man who walked the same street at the same hour each night would not have relied upon instinct alone. Precision of that kind rarely exists without assistance. It was this understanding that led him, once again, to the record of Thomas Avery's final days. The archive had already revealed the essential outline of Avery's life, but Blackwood had learned that small details often remain unnoticed until one returns with a clearer sense of what to seek. He reviewed the inventory taken from Avery's residence after his death, a document created not to explain the man, but to account for the objects he had left behind. Most of the entries were ordinary. Clothing, a writing desk, items consistent with a life lived quietly and without excess. Yet among them was a single object noted without emphasis, a pocket watch. The description itself was brief. It had been found on the bedside table. Its condition was listed as intact. There was no mention of damage, no suggestion of anything unusual. And yet, Blackwood understood that such an object would have held significance beyond its material form. A watch does not create routine, but it preserves it. It gives repetition a fixed point against which to align itself. More telling still was a final detail added almost as an afterthought. The watch had stopped. No explanation had been offered. No attempt had been made to determine why. It had simply ceased to measure time, and in doing so, had marked the quiet boundary between Avery's life and everything that followed. Blackwood left the archive with this knowledge settled carefully in his thoughts, and as he returned to the street that night, he found himself aware not only of the hour, but of the mechanism by which the hour had once been known. The lamps stood in their familiar intervals. The pavement remained unchanged. Nothing in the physical structure of the street suggested interruption. And yet the idea of the watch remained with him, not as an object, but as a symbol of precision carried out without variation. He took his place beneath the lamplight and allowed himself to remain still. Time advanced in its usual quiet manner. At 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps emerged once again. They carried the same measured rhythm, each step placed with exact consistency. The figure followed, entering the lamplight with the same steady posture, his movement neither hurried nor delayed. Blackwood watched him with a different awareness now. If Avery had once relied upon a watch to maintain his routine, then the precision of this repetition had begun as a choice. It had begun as an act of intention, confirmed night after night, until the body itself had learned the hour without needing to be told. The figure passed beneath the first lamp. His outline became clear, then softened as he crossed into shadow. He entered the next circle of light, unchanged. There was no uncertainty in his pace, no hesitation. The movement remained complete in itself. Blackwood considered, then, the moment at which the watch had stopped. A watch ceases to function at a specific second. It does not fade gradually. It does not hesitate. It stops, and in stopping, it fixes a final measure of time. Yet the routine had not stopped. Each night, at precisely 14 minutes past 2, the street continued to receive him. As the figure passed nearby, Blackwood felt no sense of disturbance. The man did not appear lost. He did not appear incomplete. He appeared exactly as he must have appeared countless times before, walking the same path, guided by the same quiet certainty. The final lamp received him once more. Beyond it, his presence softened and disappeared into darkness. The street returned to stillness. Blackwood remained where he was, aware now that routine, once established with perfect consistency, does not depend entirely upon the object that first measured it. The watch had stopped, but the hour had remained. The mechanism had failed, but the pattern had endured. Time, in its ordinary form, moves forward without repetition. Yet here, on this quiet London street, there existed a single moment that had never fully released the man who had once belonged to it. And each night, without fail, that moment returned to claim him again. There are trades in London that continue in quiet corners long after the city has learned to move faster than it once did. They survive because certain needs never truly change, and because there are still people who prefer the steady reassurance of a well-made object to the quick convenience of a disposable one. A watch, after all, is not only a tool. It is a promise that time can be held, measured, and trusted. Blackwood, carrying the thought of Avery's stopped pocket watch with him, found his attention drawn toward the most modest question of all. Not why the watch had been owned, but why it had ceased. It was easy to imagine the watch stopping as a simple mechanical failure, something ordinary that required no narrative beyond worn gears and tired springs. Yet the mind does not linger on ordinary explanations when an ordinary object appears at the edge of an extraordinary pattern. Blackwood did not allow himself to invent meaning. Instead, he returned to the documents he already possessed, and he read them again with a quieter kind of focus, looking not for dramatic detail, but for anything that suggested where the watch had come from or where it had once been taken when it needed attention. There was, among the papers, a small receipt, nothing more than a thin slip preserved by habit. It carried a name and an address, written in a careful hand, and a description so brief it was almost dismissive: cleaning and regulation. The date was placed in the months before Avery's death. Blackwood read the address twice, not because it was difficult, but because it had the kind of specificity that routine often leaves behind. Later that day, as evening began its slow descent, he walked to the shop. It was set on a narrow side street, removed from the larger flows of traffic, a place where the city's noise softened into a mild background hum. The sign above the door was modest, the lettering slightly faded, as though it had learned that those who needed it would find it without advertisement. Through the glass, the interior appeared dim and orderly. Instruments lay in their places. Tiny compartments held small parts that only trained hands would recognize. Clocks ticked at different tempos, creating a layered, gentle sound that did not disturb so much as steady the air. Blackwood entered without haste and allowed himself to become part of the quiet. He did not speak as though he were seeking a secret. He spoke as though he were tracing a simple line of continuity, and he placed the receipt gently on the counter. The exchange that followed required no urgency, only patience. The shopkeeper, accustomed to names that meant little to him beyond their relation to objects, searched through an old ledger with the practiced calm of someone who trusted paper to remember what people forget. Blackwood watched the ledger rather than the hands that turned it. Its pages were worn, its ink slightly softened by age, and yet the entries remained precise. Date, name, service performed, small notes made without drama. The world of repair is a world of quiet honesty. It does not embellish. It simply records what was done and what was found. When the entry for Thomas Avery was located, it offered exactly what Blackwood had expected in its tone and exactly what he had hoped in its detail. The watch had been brought in because it ran slightly fast. The spring had been cleaned. The balance adjusted. These were ordinary interventions, the kind that return an object to its intended rhythm. Yet beside the ordinary notes was one detail that stood out, not because it was written boldly, but because it was written at all. Avery had requested that the watch be set to chime softly at a particular minute. The minute was recorded in the simplest way possible. 2:14. Blackwood felt no sudden rush of conclusion, only the quiet settling of a connection. A man who walks the same route at the same hour might do so because he chooses the stillness of night, or because he prefers solitude, or because he finds comfort in repetition. But a man who requests a chime at an exact minute suggests something more structured. He suggests an appointment, a private ritual, a reason that does not wander. Blackwood considered what it meant for a watch to chime at a single minute each night. Not an hour, not a general reminder. A precise point in time, called forth by a small sound that would be heard only by the person who carried it. It was the kind of request that belonged to someone who did not trust memory alone, and who preferred his habits to be confirmed rather than guessed. He left the shop and walked back through the city with this detail held carefully in his mind, aware that it did not solve the mystery, but it made the mystery more human. The pattern on the street had begun as an intentional routine supported by a mechanism designed to preserve it. The street, the lamps, the footsteps, the hour itself, all of it had once belonged to a living man who had chosen precision and had built his nights around it. When Blackwood returned to the street that evening, the lamps were already lit, their amber glow resting upon the pavement with the same steady calm. He took his place beneath one of the central lights and allowed the street to remain what it always was in those hours: quiet, ordinary, and patient. As the appointed minute approached, he listened differently than before. He listened not only for footsteps, but for the idea of a chime that might once have sounded softly in a man's pocket, prompting him to rise, to reach for his coat, to cross a threshold, and to walk. At precisely 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps emerged again. The figure appeared at the far end with the same unhurried certainty and entered the lamplight without hesitation. His pace remained exact, his posture upright, his gaze fixed ahead. He moved as if guided by a rule that had never been revised. Blackwood watched him pass from one pool of light into the next, and he imagined, without forcing the image, the soft chime that might once have preceded this movement by only moments, an audible cue that had taught the body to obey time. The man passed the townhouse that had once been his and continued onward, unchanged by the presence of any observer. He did not pause. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge doorways or windows. He simply fulfilled the route until he reached the far end and faded once more into darkness. The street returned to stillness. Blackwood remained where he was, aware now that the hour had not been chosen by accident. It had been selected, reinforced, and preserved. A chime had once marked it. A habit had formed around it. And when the watch stopped, the habit had not ended. It had continued as though the world had learned the sound by heart and no longer required the mechanism that first produced it. In that quiet realization, the pattern felt less like a ghost and more like a routine that had become detached from its owner, still precise, still faithful, still arriving each night at the same minute as if time itself had been instructed never to let it go. There are rooms in old London houses that seem to hold more than furniture and air. They hold arrangement. They hold the quiet agreement between a person and the space that surrounds them, an agreement formed not in a single moment, but across years of repetition. Blackwood understood that if Thomas Avery had walked the same street at the same hour each night, then the true beginning of that movement had never been the pavement itself. It had begun here, within the stillness of a private room, where intention first became action. Through respectful inquiry, and without disturbing the natural order of the present occupant, Blackwood had been permitted to stand briefly within the front room that faced the street. He entered without haste, carrying none of the urgency that often accompanies investigation. His purpose was not to search, but to understand the relationship between interior and exterior, between the quiet moment before departure and the steady rhythm that followed. The room was modest, balanced in its proportions, and arranged in a way that did not demand attention. Its window faced the pavement directly, offering a clear and uninterrupted view of the lamps outside. The glass was clean, its surface reflecting only a softened version of the street beyond. Curtains rested at either side, their fabric still, their presence neither concealing nor revealing more than necessary. Blackwood moved closer to the window and allowed himself to stand where Avery himself had once stood countless times before. From that position, the structure of the routine became easier to imagine. The lamps outside did not appear as isolated sources of light, but as a sequence. The pavement did not appear as an empty surface, but as a path already defined. The distance between the doorway and the first circle of light was neither long nor short. It was exact. He did not imagine the man with dramatic detail. He imagined him only as a presence shaped by repetition. A coat lifted from its resting place. A watch consulted, not with uncertainty, but with confirmation. A pause that existed not because of hesitation, but because routine always contains a moment of stillness before continuation. Blackwood allowed his gaze to rest upon the street as it would appear at night. The room itself did not resist memory. Its walls held no visible mark of what had occurred there, yet its structure made clear that it had once served as the quiet origin of something precise. Routine does not announce itself. It builds gradually until the act of departure becomes as natural as remaining. He did not remain long, because the purpose of his presence had already been fulfilled. The room had revealed nothing dramatic, yet it had confirmed something more important, that the pattern he observed each night had begun as an ordinary act, performed without spectacle, and repeated until it had become inseparable from the hour itself. Later, when night had returned and the lamps had resumed their steady illumination, Blackwood took his place once more upon the pavement, directly opposite the window. From there, he could see both the path and its point of origin. He did not position himself as an interruption, but as a quiet witness, allowing the street to remain undisturbed. The stillness deepened as the hour approached. The air carried no unnecessary movement. The lamps held their light with quiet certainty. Blackwood did not check his watch, because the street itself had already taught him when to expect the moment. At precisely 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps emerged again. They arrived with the same calm precision, neither hurried nor delayed, their rhythm steady and complete. The figure followed, entering the lamplight at the far end of the street with the same upright posture and measured pace. Nothing in his movements suggested awareness. Nothing in his presence suggested uncertainty. Blackwood watched as the man approached the townhouse. The window remained still, its glass reflecting the quiet structure of the street. For a brief moment, as the figure passed directly before it, his form aligned perfectly with its surface. It was not an interruption of the reflection, but a continuation of it, as though the space within and the movement outside still belonged to the same uninterrupted sequence. The figure did not pause. He did not turn. He continued forward, crossing each interval of light and shadow with the same unbroken rhythm. In that moment, Blackwood understood that the routine had never belonged solely to the man, nor solely to the street. It belonged equally to the space between them. The room had once released him into the night. The street had received him. And even now, in the absence of the life that had first created the pattern, the structure of that exchange remained intact. The figure moved beneath the final lamp, where his outline remained clear for only a moment longer before softening into darkness once more. The street returned to stillness. Blackwood remained where he was, aware that he had traced the routine as far as it could be traced. He had stood where it began. He had watched where it continued. He had observed how it persisted without variation, held in place not by force, but by the quiet authority of repetition itself. Routine, when practiced long enough, becomes something greater than memory. It becomes part of the environment that received it. And somewhere within that quiet London street, the hour still remained exactly where it had always been, waiting patiently to be fulfilled again. There are moments in any quiet observation when patience, having been allowed its full measure of time, begins to invite a different kind of understanding. Until now, Blackwood had remained a witness at a respectful distance, allowing the pattern to continue without interference. He had watched the figure appear, cross the measured intervals of light, and disappear once more into darkness, night after night, without attempting to alter what he saw. Yet repetition, when observed long enough, begins to reveal not only its structure, but its boundaries. It suggests, without urgency, that there may come a moment when distance itself becomes part of what must be understood. Blackwood arrived that evening with the same calm presence that had guided him from the beginning. The street had already entered its familiar stillness, and the lamps stood ready in their quiet sequence, casting their steady glow upon the pavement. Nothing in their appearance suggested change. Nothing in the air suggested interruption. And yet Blackwood understood that his own role within the pattern was no longer entirely passive. He did not intend to break the routine. He intended only to move within it. He chose his position carefully, standing not at the edge of the pavement, but closer to its center, where the figure's path would pass without obstruction. He did not conceal himself. He did not alter his presence. He simply allowed himself to exist within the same physical space that the man crossed each night, trusting that observation, when carried with care, does not destroy what it seeks to understand. The hour approached with its usual quiet certainty. The city beyond the streets softened into distance. The lamps held their light without flicker. The pavement remained empty, its surface undisturbed. Blackwood stood without movement, his attention steady, his breathing calm. At precisely 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps emerged. They arrived with the same measured rhythm, their spacing exact, their presence neither concealed nor announced. The figure followed, appearing at the far end of the street and entering the lamplight with the same upright posture and unbroken pace. He did not slow. He did not hesitate. He continued forward, crossing the first interval of light and shadow exactly as he had done every night before. Blackwood remained where he was. For the first time, the distance between them would close not by observation alone, but by shared space. The figure approached, his form gradually resolving into clarity beneath the lamps. His coat moved with the same restrained motion. His gaze remained fixed ahead. There was no sign of awareness, no indication that anything in the street had altered. Blackwood felt no urgency. He did not reach out. He did not speak. He allowed the moment to unfold without force. When the figure came within a few steps, Blackwood did something he had not done before. He stepped forward. The movement was small, deliberate, and without aggression. It did not interrupt the path. It aligned with it. His step matched the direction of the figure's motion, allowing him, for the first time, to walk beside the man rather than merely watch him pass. For a brief and quiet moment, they occupied the same interval of light. The figure did not turn. He did not react. He continued forward with the same steady rhythm, his pace unchanged. Yet Blackwood noticed something he could not have seen from a distance. The man's presence, though visible, did not carry the subtle variations that living movement always contains. There was no adjustment in balance, no slight correction in stride. His motion was complete, but it was also fixed, as though it belonged to a sequence that could not be altered once it had begun. Blackwood matched his pace for several steps, neither accelerating nor falling behind. The street remained silent around them. The lamps received them both without distinction. For a moment, it was possible to imagine that they walked together not as observer and mystery, but as two figures following the same path for reasons known only to themselves. And yet, there was no sense of companionship in the movement, only continuation. Blackwood slowed. He allowed the figure to move ahead once more, returning to his original role as witness rather than participant. The man continued forward, crossing the remaining intervals of light and shadow with the same exact precision. He did not pause beneath the final lamp. He did not acknowledge the distance he had traveled. He simply continued until his outlines softened and disappeared into darkness once again. The street returned to stillness. Blackwood remained where he was, aware that he had come closer to the pattern than ever before, and that in doing so, he had confirmed something essential. The figure did not resist his presence. It did not respond to it. It existed independently of observation, sustained not by awareness, but by repetition itself. Routine, when repeated with absolute consistency, ceases to require the person who created it. It becomes something else, something that continues because it has always continued. Blackwood turned slowly and walked back along the pavement, his own footsteps softer, less exact, and entirely his own. Behind him, the lamps remained unchanged. And somewhere within their quiet sequence, the hour had once again fulfilled its promise. There is always, within any repeated action, a natural boundary beyond which it does not continue. Until now, Blackwood had observed the figure only as it moved through the illuminated portion of the street, appearing from darkness, passing beneath each lamp with steady precision, and then dissolving once more into obscurity beyond the final circle of light. The disappearance had never resembled urgency nor concealment. It had resembled completion, the quiet conclusion of something that had fulfilled its intended shape. Yet repetition, when witnessed often enough, invites a deeper consideration, and Blackwood had come to understand that the place where the pattern ended might hold as much meaning as the place where it began. He arrived earlier than usual that evening and walked slowly toward the far end of the street, allowing his attention to remain upon the gradual transition between light and shadow. The lamps stood in their familiar sequence behind him, each one defining its portion of the pavement with quiet certainty. Ahead, the final lamp cast its steady glow upon the ground, and beyond it, the street curved gently into darkness that revealed nothing and promised nothing. There was nothing in its appearance to distinguish it from any other quiet corner of London, and yet it was here, night after night, that the figure ceased to be visible. Blackwood stopped beneath the final lamp and allowed himself to remain still, his presence neither concealed nor asserted. He did not stand there as someone attempting to interrupt the pattern, but as someone aligning himself with its natural boundary. The light above him remained constant, and the pavement beneath his feet bore no visible trace of what had occurred there before. The street, in its physical form, offered no explanation. He remained facing the darkness beyond the lamp, allowing the silence of the place to settle around him without resistance. As the hour approached, the familiar stillness returned, deepening gradually until the distant sounds of the city softened into indistinct background. The air carried no unnecessary movement. The lamps held their light without flicker. The street existed exactly as it had on every previous night, unchanged and patient. Then, at precisely 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps emerged once more. They began at the far end of the street, their rhythm steady and unmistakable, and moved forward with the same calm precision that had defined them from the beginning. Blackwood did not turn immediately. He allowed the sound to approach him, understanding now that the pattern did not require his observation in order to exist. It continued because it had always continued. Gradually, the footsteps drew nearer, crossing each interval of light and shadow in quiet succession. At last, the figure entered the final circle of lamplight behind him. Blackwood remained where he was, aware of the presence without needing to see it directly. There was no sense of interruption, no sense of alteration. The movement remained complete, guided by the same unbroken consistency that had shaped it night after night. After a moment, Blackwood turned slowly. The figure stood within the light, his posture upright, his gaze fixed ahead, his presence neither diminished nor intensified by proximity. He did not acknowledge Blackwood. He did not hesitate. He existed entirely within the structure of the pattern that had brought him there. Blackwood observed him without urgency, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Then, with quiet deliberation, Blackwood stepped forward, moving beyond the reach of the lamp and into the darkness where the figure always disappeared. He did not move far, only enough to cross the boundary that separated light from shadow. There, he paused and allowed himself to stand within that unseen space, neither searching nor retreating. Behind him, the figure continued forward. The measured rhythm of his steps did not change. He reached the final lamp, entered its light, and then, as he always had, ceased to be visible. There was no sound of departure, no continuation beyond the point where the light ended. Blackwood remained in the darkness for several moments, aware now that the routine existed only within the illuminated structure of the street. It did not extend beyond it. It did not continue into the unseen distance. It began within the sequence of lamps, and it ended there, contained entirely within the space that had once received the living man's nightly passage. When Blackwood stepped back beneath the light, the pavement was empty once more. The lamps remained unchanged, their steady glow revealing nothing beyond their ordinary purpose. The street had returned to stillness, holding its quiet shape without indication that anything unusual had occurred. Blackwood understood then that he had not discovered where the man had gone. He had discovered where the pattern belonged. It was not a journey from one place to another. It was a movement contained entirely within its own repetition, beginning and ending in the same quiet agreement between time and space. He turned and walked slowly back along the street, the lamps receding behind him one by one, each one marking a portion of the path that had been crossed so many times before. There was no urgency in his movement, no need to follow further. He had seen enough to understand that the routine had reached its natural limit, and that beyond that limit, there was only the ordinary darkness of an ordinary city night. Behind him, the final lamp continued to burn, patient and unchanged, waiting for the hour when it would once again receive the steady rhythm of footsteps that had never truly left it. There are mysteries that end with revelation, and there are others that end with acceptance. Blackwood had spent many nights walking the length of that quiet London street, observing its lamps, its windows, and the steady, unbroken repetition of a man who no longer belonged to the ordinary measure of time. He had traced the routine to its origin, standing in the room where it had begun. He had followed it to its limit, standing beneath the final lamp where it ended. And in doing so, he had come to understand that not all patterns exist in order to be solved. Some exist only to be witnessed, and to remind those who notice them that repetition, when practiced long enough, becomes part of the structure of the world itself. The street had revealed everything it was capable of revealing. Thomas Avery had once lived there. He had walked at the same hour each night, guided by a quiet precision that had shaped his life into something orderly and complete. His watch had marked the minute. His room had released him into the night. His steps had crossed the pavement with steady certainty. And over time, that certainty had left its impression not only upon the stone beneath his feet, but upon the hour itself. When his life ended, the mechanism that had once measured his routine had stopped. Yet the routine had not vanished with it. It had remained, preserved within the physical memory of the street, continuing with the same calm consistency, as though time had learned the shape of his presence and had never fully released it. Blackwood returned once more, not because he expected change, but because observation, once begun, carries its own quiet obligation. The lamps stood in their familiar sequence. The pavement remained still. The houses held their silence without resistance. He took his place beneath the central lamp and allowed himself to wait, not as an investigator, but as a witness who had already come to understand the nature of what he would see. The hour approached with its usual calm certainty. The air grew still. The street settled into quiet readiness. And then, at precisely 14 minutes past 2, the footsteps emerged again. The figure appeared at the far end of the street and entered the lamplight with the same steady posture and measured pace. Nothing in his movement had altered. Nothing in his presence had diminished. He walked exactly as he always had, neither aware of observation nor dependent upon it. Blackwood watched him pass beneath each lamp, his form appearing and softening in the gentle rhythm created by light and shadow. There was no urgency in the movement, no purpose beyond continuation. The routine existed because it had always existed. For a moment, as the figure passed nearby, Blackwood understood with quiet clarity that he was not witnessing something unnatural. He was witnessing something that had once been entirely natural, preserved beyond its expected ending. The figure continued forward, crossing the final interval of light before dissolving once more into darkness. The street returned to stillness. Blackwood remained where he was, aware that nothing further needed to be done. The mystery had not ended in explanation, but in understanding. The street had not been haunted. It had been faithful. It had continued to receive a routine that had once belonged to a living man, and in doing so, it had preserved a moment that would otherwise have been lost to time. Routine, when repeated with enough care, does not disappear easily. It leaves its shape behind. It teaches the world how to expect it. And sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, the world continues to fulfill that expectation long after the person who created it has gone. Blackwood turned and walked slowly away, his own footsteps softer, less exact, and entirely his own. Behind him, the lamps remained unchanged, their steady glow marking the path that would be crossed again the following night, and the night after that, with the same quiet certainty. Somewhere, within that patient London street, the hour still remembered him. And perhaps, in its own quiet way, it always would. If you found yourself drifting into the quiet rhythm of this mystery, and if you would like to walk beside Detective Blackwood again through other forgotten streets and patient hours, consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your presence here ensures that these quiet stories continue and that you will not miss the next mystery waiting in the stillness.